Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back with, once again, another brand new MCU Disney Plus series. It's so good to be back, and it feels like it's been such a long time, because obviously, we did have What If, and that was a while ago. I mean, that ended back in October, I think, and now it's the end of November, but the thing is, that was animated. The last live-action MCU series we got was Loki, all the way back in, July. So, it's been a while, but it's definitely good to be back, and what a way to make a comeback here with the Hawkeye Disney Plus series, because we just got the first 2 episodes on Disney Plus, 2 out of 6, so we got 4 more episodes left after this, and wow, this is literally everything I wanted and more. This show is such my style. I mean, I just love anything like street level in Marvel, so that's why I was such a huge fan of the Marvel Netflix series, and this show just gives off such huge Marvel Netflix series vibes. All the street level stuff going on here is amazing. The Christmas vibes, I mean, Christmas in New York, that's just beautiful, and I love how, sure, it's a Marvel MCU series, but it's also a Christmas series. It's so good. I love that. I love that we're getting to see Clint's story explored more, especially post-Endgame, seeing what he's gone through as an Avenger, being one of the not only non-superpowered Avengers, but literally just a guy with a bow and arrow. Hailee Steinfeld's in here too as Kate Bishop, and she's just she's just perfect. She's just amazing here. We got the Tracksuit Mafia, who I mean, I was excited to see him. I didn't think they'd be this good. They're literally amazing and, hilarious. And I love the Tracksuit Mafia so far. And, of course, you cannot forget Lucky the Pizza Dog. So, guys, this is off to a great start. I mean, first 2 episodes, I'm loving it. I'm loving where things are going. This is just such my style. And I'm so excited to talk about it. But, again, we have 2 episodes to talk about in this one video. We're going to be breaking them down in depth, so we have a lot to get to. So let's go ahead and give a quick spoiler warning if you've not yet seen these 2 episodes, because obviously we're talking spoilers. So without further ado, let's jump into this with episode 1 of Hawkeye, which is titled Never Meet Your Heroes. And you kind of see why it's titled that in this episode. So this episode is actually only 30 minutes long, which I was kind of surprised by, but then it kind of makes up for it with the second episode, which is almost an hour long. So this is a half-hour-ish episode. Episode 1, we start off with a really interesting opening that I watched a lot of reviews before the premiere, and every review I watched said the opening of this series is amazing, especially for MCU fans. And I didn't think it was that great as people were hyping it up to be, but I still enjoyed it. I still thought it was really, really cool. It wasn't exactly what I was thinking when people were teasing it previously. But we start off, it's a flashback to 2012 with a young Kate Bishop who is basically witnessing the Battle of New York outside her windows, just going down outside of her house, and she sees Hawkeye out there saving the day. Now, the problem here is because of this giant battle and aliens invading New York, their house or apartment, whatever they're living in, gets kind of at least slightly bruised up and beat up and destroyed, and within the chaos, her father actually dies, or at least we assume he does, because he gets a funeral, he disappears and everything, but you never see a body. And number 1 rule in all superhero TV shows, and really any TV show in general, if you don't see the body, they're probably not dead. So while I'm not exactly sure how or why he may come back in the story, I do have a feeling he might, or even if he is actually dead, maybe at least in flashbacks, because you got a great actor in the role with, I believe it was Brian D.R.C. James in the role. He's a great actor. Fun fact, he actually played Shrek in Shrek the Musical. So I'd be kind of surprised if they just wasted that actor on one scene. But again, this was a great opening to the episode. And basically at the end of this, after his funeral and everything, her mother, Eleanor, says, "I'm here for you. Anything you need, I can do it for you." And Kate says, "I'm going to need a bow and arrow," because of course she saw Hawkeye out there, so now she wants to be a hero just like Hawkeye. And the opening credits of this episode actually showcase her training, so we get to see her going through all of her training of archery and fencing and karate and all this stuff, and just all these different forms of training just from such a young age. So you can really tell how she becomes such a skilled fighter that she now is in present day. Which, speaking of present day, that's where we then transition to, where we start off with Kate, now grown up, as Hailee Steinfeld. Amazing. And her friends are daring her to ring a bell with an arrow. So she does that, and she shoots the bell, but actually ends up destroying it. So that's not great. And of course, as you can already tell just from that opening scene and now this first present day scene with Kate Bishop, this really is Kate Bishop's show. I mean, this whole show was kind of sold to us as, alright, this is Jeremy Renner's Clint Barton Hawkeye show. But it's really, I mean, it's both of their shows, but I do feel like Hailee Steinfeld's Kate Bishop is more of the star, just because, you know, sure, the series is called Hawkeye, but in the comics they both go by the name Hawkeye. So I don't have a problem with it, because like Clint has been in the MCU for years, and we know Kate Bishop's going to be a big character going forward, so they really need like all this screen time to develop her character. But speaking of Clint, we do then move on to him, where of course, as we saw in the trailers, he and his family are at Rogers the Musical, which is basically this giant musical. We only see one part of it, and it is called Rogers the Musical, so I assume it's the whole story of Steve Rogers and Captain America. But the part we see is the first Avengers movie, the Battle of New York. And it was so funny but so sad at the same time, because it's like so true in the real world, because Clint's sitting there watching this musical, basically reliving the events of the Battle of New York, and they're basically spotlighting all the different characters, like, oh, Hulk Smash, and Iron Man, and Captain America, and Black Widow, and then just completely ignores Hawkeye. Hawkeye's there in the musical, they just don't mention him at all, but for some reason, they do mention Ant-Man. They definitely make sure to spotlight Ant-Man, even though, as Clint points out in this episode, he wasn't even a superhero back then. But alright, whatever, nobody cares about Hawkeye. So I thought that was hilarious, but also, like, you gotta feel so bad for Clint, because, you know, he's a superhero, but, you know, he doesn't really get the credit for it, and that's the same thing in real life. Now, another couple things during this scene when they're watching Rogers the Musical is, first of all, that they really focus in on Black Widow, because, of course, Clint recently just lost his best friend, Natasha Romanoff, so he's really missing her in this episode, and also his hearing aid. So we see that he now has a hearing aid. He actually turns that off because he just does not want to listen to that musical any longer, but we do get an explanation on that in episode 2, kind of explaining why he has the hearing aid. So we'll get into that when we talk about episode 2. But for now, let's get back to Kate, because she goes ahead and visits her mom, again now in present day, and she and Jack Duquesne, I probably pronounced that wrong. I should have paid more attention to the pronunciation in the show, but basically Jack, again, hard to pronounce last name, in the comics is the swordsman, and he is actually the one that originally trained Clint Barton to become Hawkeye. He trained him in his archery skills and his sword fighting skills as well. So we already knew he was going to be playing a large role in this series, but he's already playing an even bigger role than I even expected, a much more villainous role. So anyway, the three of them, they go to this charity event where Kate meets up with Armand Duquesne, again, whatever that last name is, and he reveals to Kate that Eleanor and Jack are actually engaged and they're getting married. So Kate's pretty upset by this, and she's like, oh, you're rushing into this and all this stuff. So she kind of storms off, but in her way out, she actually stumbles upon a secret black market auction. So she kind of does a little investigating here, of course using her vigilante skills, and she finds that both Jack and Armand are in attendance. But what's so interesting about this secret black market auction is the items that are for sale, because the first item up for sale, well, the first one is like a giant triceratops head or something like that, but the first one that's really of importance to us is the Ronin Sword, because of course in Avengers Endgame, during the 5-year time jump, Clint Barton became basically this ninja known as Ronin, you know, trying to get justice and murdering a bunch of people basically. So now this sword is for sale at this auction. And Armand is actually the one that buys it. And then actually the next item up for sale is the full-on Ronin suit. And they do explain that these items were recovered from the Avengers compound. So I suppose that makes sense, and I thought that was pretty cool. But all of a sudden, there's a giant explosion because the tracksuit mafia attacks and they're trying to steal some stuff. And that is when Jack actually takes that opportunity to steal back the sword, the Ronin sword, because again, in the comics, he's swordsman. So he has an obsession with swords and, basically sharp objects. And Kate actually takes the Ronin suit. So she suits up and she battles the tracksuit mafia. Then as this battle then leads outside, she meets up with Lucky, this dog that she just finds on the side of the street, but basically decides to adopt as her own. And after all of this happens, and after actually even just during this battle, Clint then actually sees this going down on TV, that the Ronin has returned. So of course he's got to investigate because, it's super confusing, like, wait, I was Ronin, so who is this now? So he goes out there, and he goes to basically save Kate. But before we get to that, actually, Kate takes Lucky back to her apartment, and she's like, oh, I need to feed you. So she feeds Lucky some pizza, because of course in the comics, Lucky is known as Pizza Dog, so I thought that was really cool that they're already getting into that there. And then she goes back out, and she finds Armand dead in his apartment. So of course the big question is, oh, who killed Armand? Well, he did kind of look like he was murdered with with the amount of blood that's on the floor and the wound and everything. Kind of looks like he was slashed by a sword. Maybe the Ronin sword that Jack just stole. Probably. That's kind of what's set up there in specifically episode 2. But we don't even have enough time to get into that here in this episode because the tracksuit mafia attacks her again. And that is when Clint shows up, confronts her, the new Ronin, and unmasks her. So then that right there is where episode 1 ends. Again, it was a great episode. I loved it as a premiere. And then we transitioned right into episode 2, which again was a longer episode. It was closer to an hour. And it basically picks up right where we left off at the end of episode 1, where Clint basically interrogates Kate now. And so they go back to Kate's apartment. And I love how Kate is just nerding out at Clint, and she's like, oh, you're my favorite Avenger and everything, especially because, in public, people know he's an Avenger, but nobody really recognizes him as, the greatest superhero, but to her, he is, and I thought that was really cool. And Clint actually reveals that he knows the tracksuit mafia, he has history with them, supposedly he specifically has history with them as Ronin. And coincidentally, this is when the tracksuit mafia actually show up at her apartment because they actually follow them there. So Clint, Kate, and Lucky are able to escape, but unfortunately, they have to leave the Ronin suit behind. So Kate goes to her aunt's apartment since she's out of town for a while. Meanwhile, Clint goes back to Kate's original apartment to try and get the suit, but the suit is gone. So that's when she goes back to Kate's aunt's apartment, and I love how he's cleaning up her wounds and stuff, and is just automatically going into basically medical mode, and just automatically knows all the tips and tricks for healing these wounds, because again, he's just been a normal guy out there with a bow and arrow. So of course he's got plenty of experience with wounds and scratches and scrapes and all that stuff. So I love really seeing that represented here, seeing the perspective from almost a normal guy as a part of the Avengers. I think that's really cool, and I like seeing that spotlighted here in the series. But now the unfortunate thing, though, is basically Clint's Christmas has been ruined because he just wanted to spend Christmas, his first normal Christmas with his kids in years. But instead, he's now stuck with Kate and figuring this whole thing out here. So he sends his kids to the airport, promises he's going to be home for Christmas. Really hoping he is. I'm hoping he gets that happy ending there. But then we get a nice conversation here between Kate and Clint where they're just walking around throughout New York City. Again, New York City just looks beautiful during Christmas time and during the holidays. So this is where they actually bring up the whole hearing loss thing. So she asked why he has a hearing aid and how he started getting his hearing loss and everything. And, it's kind of turned into a joke, and he's like, oh, I have no idea. But it does show kind of a quick montage of basically him being involved and being around a bunch of explosions and gunshots and all that stuff, which, yeah, makes sense that would kind of do something to his hearing and would lead to hearing loss. So, even though it's not really super duper spotlight here, I did like that they at least gave a little bit of an explanation, and again, it does make a lot of sense. And another thing Kate mentions is just, like, his branding. It's like, the reason you're not, like, a famous superhero is because, you know, branding, you're just, like, trying to be, like, the cool, serious guy, and that's not what people are into nowadays. But Clint does actually get a lead on the Ronin suit because he finds out that one of the New York City LARPers has basically stolen the suit. So we get this really cool scene where Clint is just, like, dominating the LARPers field and just, like, this whole roleplay thing, like, killing everybody, quote, killing everyone with his wooden sword. And basically this guy that stole the suit, his name is Grills, and he says, you know, if you let me kill you, quote, kill you, then I'll just give you the suit. So that's exactly what happens. It was pretty cool. It was a nice little sequence that I did enjoy seeing here. But then we get back to Kate's story where she actually has dinner with Jack and Eleanor, and she fences Jack because, again, they have that interest, or common interest, with sword fighting and fencing. And she just automatically blurts out that she thinks that Jack is hiding something. And then we kind of get the reveal that he is hiding something because he offers Kate a butterscotch. The same exact butterscotch that was found at the scene of the crime next to Armand's dead body. Which, again, it already kind of looked like he was killed by sword. Which we know Jack now has possession of multiple swords, including the Ronin Sword. And now the butterscotch, it's got to be a thing. I mean, it's got to be that Jack did it. He done did it. But also, I think it's also kind of a red herring at the same time. Because, you know, this is very obvious. So, actually, maybe he isn't the one that did it. Because I actually think that Eleanor is the true one that's behind it. And they're trying to make it look like, oh, she's just Kate's nice mother and everything. But I really think she's going to be the one behind it all. And possibly even become the villain Madame Mask from the comics too, which it has been rumored for a while that would be the case. So maybe even she actually, like, used the swords that Jack owned, or, like, is framing him or something like that. I don't know, maybe they're both doing it together. I'm not completely sure, but definitely something fishy's going on there, and I'm excited to see where it goes. But then we get into kind of the final part of the episode where we kind of get into some trouble for our characters because Kate calls Clint, but turns out he's been kidnapped by the Tracksuit Mafia. So she tracks his phone, and she just ends up getting caught herself. But then the big ending for this episode is Ivan, kind of the leader of the Tracksuit Mafia, walking into this room where he meets up with Maya Lopez, played by Alaqua Cox, aka Echo, who is basically the first deaf Native American superhero in the MCU. It was announced on the Disney Plus day that she's getting her own spin-off series on Disney Plus, and Ivan just says, we have them both. And that's it. That's where it ends, and she's kind of set up to have this big role here. Now, I am interested to find out why she wanted specifically Clint and Kate. Is it just so she could get the Ronin suit? Because in the comics, Maya Lopez actually does become Ronin. I believe she's actually the original Ronin, possibly even before Clint took on the mantle. So that could possibly be what's set up here. I don't know for sure. But guys, again, I'm loving this. I love this show. This series is fully my style. I love the vibes. Everything's going on here. I love it. And I'm so excited to see where this mystery leads. Again, there's some interesting stuff going on here with our villains, with Jack and Eleanor, and also the Tracksuit Mafia and Maya Lopez. And then also, of course, our heroes with Kate and Clint and, of course, Lucky. And there's just some great stuff going on here that I'm really having a lot of fun with. And I'm so excited to see Hawkeye finally get the spotlight. I really do think that, honestly, I mean, we're only 2 episodes in. And this could just be just because I just finished watching it and I'm like, oh, bias and everything. But I honestly do think this is my favorite MCU Disney Plus series so far. I mean, I was kind of already saying this before the series even started just because I was looking forward to it so much. But it really has lived up to the hype and I am really enjoying it that much. I'm having so much fun with this series. But guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think about the 2-episode premiere of the Hawkeye Disney Plus series? What are your favorite parts? Anything you don't like? What do you think is going on with this whole mystery with all our characters? Let me know all your thoughts, theories, and predictions in the comments below. Stay tuned and join me again next week where we'll be breaking down episode 3 of the Hawkeye Disney Plus series. But for now, guys, thanks so much for watching. Please drop a like if you enjoyed this video and hit the subscribe button so I can keep you up to date on everything that goes on in the Marvel life.